One office can collect the reports, one council can advise on the science, one whistleblower can make a claim, one witness can describe what they saw, one video can ignite public attention. But none of that answers the bigger question. Who actually controls UFO disclosure? Who decides what gets investigated? Who decides what gets classified? Who decides what gets released? Who decides whether the public sees raw data, edited summaries, declassified files, or nothing at all? Because if recent reporting is accurate, the next phase of UAP discovery may not simply revolve around Arrow, Avileob, AI, satellites, or scientific review. It may revolve around governance, a new UAP Governance Board, an interagency structure bringing together military, intelligence, law enforcement, and civilian agencies, a system designed to coordinate UAP investigations, support Arrow, manage data collection, advise on declassification, and shape how the government handles unidentified anomalous phenomenon. That sounds administrative, it sounds procedural, it sounds bureaucratic, but do not underestimate what this means, because in the UFO world, whoever controls the process may ultimately control the truth. Welcome to UFO to UAP, I am your host Matt Tones. Today we're investigating the UAP Governance Board, not just what it is, not just who may be involved, but what it reveals about the future of UFO disclosure. Because episode 50 asked whether science is entering disclosure. Episode 51 asked the next question. If science is advising the process, who is governing the process? And that may be the most important question of all. For decades, the UFO conversation has been built around fragments, a sighting, a testimony, a leaked video, a newspaper headline, a declassified memo, a congressional hearing, a pilot report, a whistleblower claim, a government denial, a government correction, a government reclassification, a government release. The public sees moments, but behind those moments are systems, and those systems decide what becomes visible. This is part of the UAP issue many people miss. Disclosure is not just about evidence, disclosure is about control. Control over records, control over classification, control over interagency coordination, control over who gets access, control over what language is used, control over what is confirmed, control over what remains unresolved, and control over what the public is allowed to know. That is why the reported UAP Governance Board matters. It suggests the UAP issue has become too complex for a single office, a single agency, or a single scientific council to manage alone. This is no longer simply a question of strange objects in the sky. It is a question of how government systems respond when the unknown moves across military, intelligence, scientific, legal, and public domains. Think about what a serious UAP case may involve. A pilot sees something, radar detects something, an infrared sensor records something, a satellite may have passed overhead, a military installation may have logged activity, law enforcement may have received reports, the intelligence community may have collected signals, Arrow may have received a case file, Congress may ask questions, journalists may file requests, the public may demand answers, and somewhere inside that maze, decisions must be made. Who owns the case? Who analyzes the data? Who compares the sensor records? Who determines whether it is a drone, balloon, aircraft, satellite, foreign platform, atmospheric phenomenon, sensor error, classified system, or genuine unknown? Who decides whether the case is a threat? Who decides whether it can be discussed publicly? Who decides whether the file is declassified? Who decides what gets redacted? That is governance, and governance may be the hidden architecture behind the entire disclosure process. This is why episode 51 matters. We're not looking at another UFO case. We're looking at the system that may decide how future UFO cases are heard. And that brings us to the reported UAP Governance Board. Based on recent reportings and public discussion, the board appears to be designed as an interagency body. That phrase matters. Interagency. It means this is not just one Pentagon office working alone. It suggests coordination across different parts of the government. military agencies, law enforcement, the intelligence community, civilian agencies, potentially scientific advisors, potentially declassification authorities, potentially policy officials. Each of these groups have different responsibilities and each has different incentives. The military thinks in terms of threat, airspace, defense, and operational security. The intelligence community thinks in terms of sources, methods, adversary capabilities, and classified collection. Law enforcement thinks in terms of domestic events, witnesses, evidence handling, and jurisdiction. Civilian agencies may think in terms of airspace, public communication, science, or infrastructure. Scientists think in terms of measurement, data quality, methodology, uncertainty, and peer review. The public thinks in terms of truth, and those perspectives do not always align. That is why a governance board can become powerful, not because it sees every case, but because it may determine how these competing interests are coordinated. It may become the place where disclosure meets national security, where science meets classification, where public transparency meets operational secrecy, where evidence meets bureaucracy. And that is where the UAP issue has always lived, in the tension between what people want to know and what governments are willing to reveal. Question for you. Do you think a UAP governance board makes UFO disclosure more organized, or does it make disclosure more controlled? Add your answer in the comments because that question goes directly to the heart of this episode. Now, let's place this in context. In episode 50, we explored the UAP Science Advisory Council. That council matters because it represents a possible shift towards scientific review, avileoeb, data analysis, AI tools, anomaly detection, instrumentation, scientific methodology. That is the science layer. But the government's board appears to be something broader. The Science Council may ask, what does the evidence show? The governance board may ask, how does the government respond? Those are very different questions. Science can identify an anomaly, governance decides what happens next. Science can recommend better data collection, governance decides whether agencies adopt those recommendations. Science can say the evidence is insufficient, governance decides whether that conclusion is released publicly. Science can request access to better sensor records. Governance decides whether access is granted. Science can help classify cases by quality. Governance decides how those cases move through official systems. This is why the governance board may ultimately be more influential than the Science Advisory Council. The council advises, the board coordinates, and coordination is power. That power can be used productively, it can reduce confusion, it can eliminate duplicate effort, it can prevent cases from being lost between agencies, it can create consistent standards, it can support Arrow, it can improve classification, it can help the public receive clearer information, but it can also be used to manage narratives, to slow disclosure, to restrict access, to protect institutional interests, to centralize control, to decide that some information is too sensitive, too confusing, too embarrassing, or too operationally revealing to release. That is the dilemma. A UAP governance board could be a transparency mechanism, or it could become the next layer of controlled disclosure, possibly both, because governments rarely disclose information without managing risk, and UAP information carries multiple risks: national security risk, public trust risk, scientific credibility risk, political risk, intelligence risk, and perhaps most importantly, uncertainty risk. What do I mean by uncertainty risk? I mean the risk that the government may not have clean answers. The public often imagines disclosure as a locked room full of secrets. Open the door and the truth comes out. But what if the room contains fragments, partial records, conflicting reports, low-resolution imagery, classified sensor data, unverified testimony, historical gaps, cases that remain unresolved not because the truth is being hidden, but because the evidence is incomplete? That possibility is uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable for believers, it is uncomfortable for skeptics, it is uncomfortable for government officials, it is uncomfortable for scientists, because everybody wants clarity. But UAP is not a field built on clarity. It is a field built on uncertainty. And governance exists to manage uncertainty. And that is why this board matters. Not because it proves anything about the origin of UAP, but because it tells us the UAP issue has reached a level where government coordination itself has become necessary. That alone is significant. The question is why now? Why create or formalize a governance structure at this stage? The answer may be found in the broader UAP environment. Over the last several years, the government has faced increasing pressure from multiple directions: congressional interest, whistleblower claims, public hearings, Arrow case reviews, declassified file releases, military pilot reports, media scrutiny, scientific pressure, and a growing expectation that UAP should be treated as a serious subject rather than a fringe topic. Arrow was created to bring structure to investigation. The UAP Science Advisory Council suggests an effort to bring science into the process. The UAP Governance Board suggests something even larger, an attempt to manage the entire UAP system. Reporting, investigation, data collection, interagency coordination, Arrow support, declassification, transparency, policy, and possibly public communication. This is the evolution of the modern UFO issue. It began as sightings, it became investigations, it became classification, it became disclosure pressure, it became institutional reform, and now it may be entering the governance phase. That phase may sound dry, governance phase, but it could define what happens next, because the future of UFO disclosure may not be decided by a single whistleblower or a single video. It may be decided by process. Who controls the data? Who has authority? Who sets standards? Who decides what is releasable? Who coordinates between agencies? Who has the final say? That is why this episode is called UAP Governance Board Explained. Who controls UFO disclosure now? Because the title is the question. Who controls UFO disclosure now? Is it Arrow? Is it ODNI? Is it the Pentagon? Is it the intelligence community? Is it Congress? Is it the White House? Is it scientists? Is it law enforcement? Is it classification authorities? Is it the public applying pressure from outside? Or is it some combination of all of them? The honest answer may be that no single institution controls the entire process, and that may be precisely why a governance board is needed. Fragmentation has haunted the UFO issue for decades. Project Blue Book had one kind of mandate. The Condon Report had another. ATIP operated in a different context. The UAP Task Force operated under different pressures. Arrow emerged under a modern all-domain framework. Congress has its own oversight role. The intelligence community has its own classification concerns. Military branches have their own data. Private contractors may have their own systems. Civilian agencies may hold relevant records. No single pathway has ever fully controlled the UAP issue. That may be one reason the public has struggled to get clear answers, not simply because secrets exist, but because the system itself is complex. A governance board could potentially address that. It could create a single coordination point. It could help determine where cases go. It could help establish procedures for data handling. It could help coordinate declassification. It could help Arrow, science advisors, intelligence officials, and agency representatives. That is the optimistic view. The skeptical view is that centralization can also reduce transparency. When information flows through a central authority, that authority gains power. It can decide what moves forward, what slows down, what gets reviewed, what gets buried, what gets released, what gets rewritten, what gets classified. This is why transparency advocates should pay close attention to the board's outputs. Not the announcement, not the name, not the promise, the outputs. What does it actually produce? Public reports, clear standards, case categories, declassification recommendations, data collection reforms, scientific review protocols, Arrow support, better witness reporting systems, more transparency around unresolved cases? Or does it produce only internal guidance that the public never sees? That is how we judge whether the UAP Governance Board matters. Now, let's talk about declassification. This may be one of the most important aspects of the board's reported purpose. Declassification is not simply pressing a button. National security information is governed by rules, authorities, procedures, reviews, and risk assessments. A document may contain information about a UAP event, but it may also contain sensor capabilities, military locations, intelligence methods, names, operational details, foreign intelligence, communication channels, technical data. A government agency may be willing to release the UAP part, but not the collection method. this creates redactions, and redactions create distrust. The public sees black bars and asks, what are they hiding? Sometimes the answer may be extraordinary. Sometimes the answer may be very ordinary. Sometimes the redaction may protect a radar capability, a source, a location, a system, or a person. But without context, every redaction becomes suspicious. This is one of the biggest challenges in the UAP disclosure. How do you release enough information to build trust without revealing sensitive capabilities? A governance board that coordinates declassification could help. It could create better pathways for reviewing UAP-related records. It could reduce agency delays. It could decide what can be safely released. It could help translate classified complexity into public summaries. But again, there is risk. If the board becomes the gatekeeper for declassification, then the public must ask, what are the standards? Who sits on it? Who has veto power? How are disagreements resolved? Does science influence declassification? Does Arrow? Does ODNI? Does the Pentagon? Does law enforcement? Does the intelligence community? Does Congress see more than the public? And if the public disagrees with what is released, what mechanisms exist to challenge it? These are not conspiracy questions, these are governance questions. They are the questions any serious citizen should ask when national security and public transparency collide. Question for you. When UAP files are released with heavy redactions, do you assume those redactions protect legitimate national security, or do you suspect they protect the government narrative? Put your answer in the comments because this is one of the biggest trust issues in the entire disclosure process. Now, let's bring Arrow into the center of this. Arrow remains one of the key officers in the modern UAP system. Its role is to address unidentified anomalous phenomena through a scientific and data-driven framework. But Arrow has also faced criticism. Some critics argue that Arrow has been too cautious. Others argue it has not been transparent enough. Others argue it lacks access to the most sensitive programs. Others argue it is doing exactly what it is designed to do: investigate cases carefully, avoid speculation, and protect declassified information. The UAP Governance Board could change Arrow's environment. It may support Arrow. It may coordinate agencies around Arrow. It may help with data collection. It may assist with declassification pathways. It may bring scientific advisors into contact with the kinds of questions Arrow faces. But it could also complicate the picture. If Arrow is no longer the only visible node in the process, the public may become even more confused. Who speaks for UAP investigations? Arrow? The Governance Board? The Science Advisory Council, ODNI, the Pentagon, the White House, Congress? This matters because public trust depends on clarity. If the government creates too many structures without clear public explanation, the process may look serious internally but confusing externally. That is a real risk. The UAP issue already suffers from institutional ambiguity. Adding a governance board could solve that or deepen it. The difference will depend on communication. The government must explain clearly, what does Arrow do? What does the Governance Board do? What does the Science Advisory Council do? Who has authority? Who advises? Who decides? Who investigates? Who releases? Who reports to the public? Without this clarity, the system may become another source of suspicion, and suspicion is already the default setting in the UAP community. That suspicion did not emerge from nowhere, it emerged from decades of secrecy, changing explanations, incomplete records, stigma, and institutional silence. If the government wants public trust, You cannot simply create a board and expect applause. It must demonstrate that the board improves transparency. That means outputs, public summaries, plain language explanations, clear standards, timelines, case updates, disclosure criteria, and perhaps most importantly, honest uncertainty, because the public can handle uncertainty. What the public struggles with is uncertainty wrapped in silence. There is a difference. Saying we do not know yet, and here is what we are doing to find out, is very different from saying nothing. That is the opportunity before the UAP Governance Board. It can help mature the conversation. It can move disclosure away from rumor and toward process. It can support science without pretending science already has the answer. It can support Arrow without turning Arrow into a black box. It can support declassification without pretending all secrets can be released. It can support transparency without compromising national security. That is the ideal version, but ideals are not outcomes. Outcomes require pressure, congressional pressure, public pressure, scientific pressure, journalistic pressure, internal pressure from people who believe the system must improve. This is why the public still matters, especially in a governance-driven disclosure process, because without public attention, bureaucracies drift inward. They protect themselves, they move slowly, they prioritize risk avoidance, they avoid controversy. They produce reports that are technically accurate, but publicly unsatisfying. The public does not control declassification, but the public can shape political pressure, and political pressure shapes disclosure. That has been true throughout the modern UAP era. Congressional hearings did not happen in a vacuum. Arrow did not emerge in a vacuum. File releases did not happen in a vacuum. The shift from UFO to UAP did not happen in a vacuum. Each step was shaped by pressure from witnesses, from journalists, from lawmakers, from researchers, from the public. The UAP Governance Board is now part of that same story. It is not just a government structure, it is a response to a phenomenon that refuses to stay outside the institutional mainstream. And that raises a deeper question. What does it mean when the unknown requires governments? Think about that. For most of history, UFOs were treated as reports, stories, sightings, claims. Now they require offices, councils, boards, data systems, AI tools, declassification processes, interagency coordination. That transformation is significant. It does not prove UAP are extraterrestrial. It does not prove crash retrieval programs. It does not prove hidden technology. But it does prove the issue has institutional weight. Governments do not build governance structures around nothing. They build them around persistent problems. And UAP has become a persistent problem, a national security problem, a data problem, a classification problem, a public trust problem, a scientific problem, a political problem, a reporting problem, a declassification problem, and now apparently a governance problem. That is the real story. The UAP Governance Board is not the answer to the mystery, it is evidence that the mystery has become too complicated to manage informally. Now let's look ahead. What should we watch for? First, membership. Who is represented? Military, intelligence, law enforcement, civilian science, Arrow, ODNI? The answer matters because membership shapes priorities. Second, authority. Can the board require agencies to cooperate? Or can it only recommend? Can it compel data sharing? Can it influence declassification? Can it set standards? Can it direct processes? Or is it advisory only? Third, transparency. Will the public receive updates? Will there be reports? Will findings be summarized? Will unresolved cases be discussed? Will declassification criteria be explained? Fourth, scientific integration. Will the Science Advisory Council meaningfully influence the board, or will science remain outside the most sensitive decisions? Fifth, Arrow's role. Will the board strengthen Arrow or create overlapping authority? Sixth, outcomes. Will we see better data, better public communication, faster releases, clearer case resolutions, or simply more bureaucracy? These are the questions that should guide our assessment. Not excitement, not cynicism, assessment. Because if UFO to UAP has one central principle, it is this: follow the system, not just the story. The story gets attention, the system reveals power. And the UAP Governance Board is a system story. It tells us the government is not just investigating sightings, it is organizing the process around sightings. That is a major development. Question for you: who do you think should have the final say over UAP disclosure? The Pentagon, intelligence agencies, scientists, Congress, or the public? Tell me in the comments, because this question may define the next era of disclosure. As we move toward the end of this episode, let's bring the pieces together. Episode 50 asks whether science is entering UFO disclosure. Episode 51 asks who governs disclosure once science enters the room. That is the key distinction. Science can advise, governance decides. Science can recommend, governance coordinates. Science can identify gaps. Governance determines whether those gaps are addressed. Science can ask for data. Governance controls access. Science can say a case is unresolved. Governance decides what the public hears. This is why governance matters. It is not glamorous. It is not cinematic. It does not have the emotional force of a pilot describing an encounter. It does not have the drama of a whistleblower allegation. It does not have the mystery of Roswell. But it may determine the future of all of them, because the next era of UFO disclosure may not be defined by one explosive revelation. It may be defined by who controls the flow of information, who structures the investigation, who validates the science, who coordinates the agencies, who signs off on declassification, and who decides what the public gets to know. That is why we need to pay attention now, not after the first report, not after the first controversy, not after the first heavily redacted release. Now, because governance structures shape outcomes long before the public sees the result. If the UAP Governance Board is built around genuine transparency, scientific seriousness, interagency accountability, and meaningful declassification, it could become one of the most important developments in modern UAP history. If it becomes a closed coordination body with limited public output, it may become another layer between the public and the truth. At this stage, we do not know which version it will become. And that is why scrutiny matters. We shouldn't just dismiss it. We should not blindly trust it. We should watch it carefully, because the future of UFO disclosure may now depend less on whether the government has files and more on how the government governs those files, less on whether witnesses speak and more on whether institutions listen, less on whether scientists advise and more on whether decision makers act, less on whether data exists and more on whether the public ever sees enough of it to judge for itself. That is the world we are entering, a world where the unknown is not just witnessed, it is processed, reviewed, classified, declassified, coordinated, advised upon, governed, and perhaps eventually understood. This has been UFO to UAP. I'm your host, Matt Tones. If you found this episode valuable, follow the show, share it with someone interested in UFO disclosure, UAP investigations, ARROW, ODNI, declassified records, and the future of government transparency. And remember, the question is no longer what is in the sky. The question is who controls what we are allowed to know.